If someone had told me a month ago that my marriage would unravel in a single night, I would have laughed. I would have called them crazy. Lillian and I had been together for nearly a decade. We had built a life, shared dreams, and made promises I believed in. But the night she went to that party, something in her changed. And after what I found out, something in me broke. I remember the moment it started. It was a Thursday evening. I had just gotten home from work, tired but looking forward to our usual routine. I had picked up dinner from her favorite restaurant, thinking we'd have a quiet night together. But when I walked into the house, I found her standing in front of the mirror, slipping into a dress I had never seen before, something sleek, elegant, and far more revealing than her usual style. I froze in the doorway. Going somewhere? She barely glanced at me. It's just a party, Vernon. Some people from work. It's last minute. That didn't sit right with me. Lillian wasn't a spontaneous person. She planned everything down to the smallest detail. And lately, there had been a shift in her. A distance I couldn't quite put into words. I didn't know you had plans tonight. I set the takeout bag on the counter, watching her carefully. Why didn't you mention it earlier? She sighed, still fixing her hair. I didn't think it was a big deal. Just something fun. That was another thing. Lillian and I did everything together. We always talked about our days, shared our schedules, and never kept secrets. But this felt different. Where is it? I pressed. She hesitated. At a private place. I don't know the exact address yet. That set off alarms in my head. You don't know where you're going? She let out a short laugh, waving me off. I'll get the details when I'm on the way. Vernon, don't make this a thing. But it already was a thing. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing sense of unease that I just couldn't shake. I don't like this, I admitted. It doesn't sound safe. Who's hosting it? For the first time, her expression changed, just for a split second. There was something in her eyes, something cautious. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. It's just a friend of a friend. I studied her, waiting for more, but she didn't offer anything else. You don't have to go, I told her. We could just stay in, watch a movie, have dinner. She finally turned to face me fully, a strange look on her face. Vernon, I need this. I want to have fun. Can you not make a big deal out of it? And with that, she grabbed her purse and walked out the door. I watched her go, that uneasy feeling in my gut settling into something heavier. Something was wrong. I just didn't know how bad it was going to be yet. But I was about to find out. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the door as if she might change her mind and walk back in. But she didn't. The food on the counter went cold. The house, usually filled with the sound of her humming in the kitchen or the background noise of a show we half paid attention to, was eerily silent. I tried distracting myself, flipping through channels, scrolling through my phone, but my mind kept circling back to the way she had looked at me before leaving. Like I was in her way. Something about that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that she was just going to a party, that I didn't own her, and she was allowed to have her own life outside of me. But the unease sat heavy in my chest. Lillian had never been secretive before. She had never dismissed my concerns so easily. A thought crossed my mind, one I didn't like. Should I call her? I shook my head, irritated at myself. No, I wasn't going to be that guy. The paranoid, overbearing husband who couldn't let his wife have a night out. I wasn't. But something still felt off. I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I logged into our shared phone account, something we had set up ages ago when we first got married. We never really used it. I trusted her, and she trusted me. But tonight, I had an overwhelming urge to see where she had gone. When the location loaded, my stomach dropped. She wasn't at a restaurant or a bar. She was at a private residence on the outskirts of town. A gated property, one I didn't recognize. I zoomed in on the map, my fingers shaking slightly. There were no businesses around, no signs of a typical social gathering. Just a house. A very large house. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Maybe it really was just a work thing. Maybe one of her colleagues had invited her. But why hadn't she given me any details? Why did she act like I was being unreasonable for asking? I tapped on her contact and hovered over the call button. Then, suddenly, her location disappeared. She had turned off her phone. A cold chill ran down my spine. Lillian never turned off her phone. Not when she went out. Not when she traveled. Not ever. Even if she was low on battery, she always made sure I could reach her. My pulse pounded in my ears. Something wasn't right. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe her battery had died. Maybe she was just trying to enjoy her night without distractions. But none of that explained the secrecy. The way she left without so much as a proper goodbye. I needed to know. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. I had to see for myself. The drive felt longer than it was. My hands clenched the steering wheel, my mind spiraling into worst-case scenarios. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe she had just turned off her phone to be present in the moment. Maybe this really was just some work event, and I was making a fool of myself by driving out here like some paranoid husband. But deep down, I knew. Something about the way she left, the way she dismissed my concerns. It wasn't normal. And the fact that she had turned off her phone the second I checked her location, that was a choice. I took a deep breath as I pulled up to the address. The house was massive, far bigger than I had imagined. A sleek, modern mansion, hidden behind high walls and a heavy iron gate. The kind of place that screamed wealth, exclusivity. The driveway was lined with expensive cars, the kind you only see in magazines. This wasn't just some casual gathering. My stomach twisted. The gate was open, probably left that way for arriving guests. So I pulled off to the side of the road and parked my car where it wouldn't stand out. If I was going to do this, I needed to be careful. I needed to see what was happening before I confronted her. I stepped out, heart hammering against my ribs as I approached the entrance. Laughter spilled out from inside, mingled with the sound of music, soft, expensive-sounding jazz. There were no security guards, no list to sign in on. Just an open invitation to anyone who knew where to come. I hesitated at the door. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I slipped inside. The first thing that hit me was the atmosphere. Dim lighting, soft music, an air of exclusivity. People dressed to impress. Men in tailored suits, women in expensive gowns. There was something intimate about it. Not wild, not chaotic, but controlled. Sophisticated. I scanned the room, searching for Lillian. My heart pounded. What was this place? A private event for the wealthy? A networking party for people playing at a different level? Then I saw her. She was across the room, standing near a sleek marble bar, her back to me. She was talking to a man. Tall, well-dressed, confident. I felt my stomach twist as I watched her laugh, her hand grazing his arm like it was second nature, like it was something she had done before. I told myself to calm down. It was just a conversation, just a casual interaction. But as I stepped closer, weaving through the crowd, I caught something. The way she looked at him. Not like a stranger, not like a colleague, but like someone she knew, someone she was comfortable with, someone she had been waiting for. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. She leaned in, close enough that their faces nearly touched. And then, she whispered something in his ear, something that made him smirk, his hand grazing the small of her back. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I wanted to storm over. I wanted to grab her by the arm, pull her away, demand to know what the hell was going on. But I didn't. Because suddenly, I realized, I needed more than anger. I needed the truth. And the only way to get it was to stay in the shadows. To watch. To wait. To let her show me exactly who she had become. I stood there, frozen, as the weight of the moment sank in. Lillian wasn't just at some work event. She wasn't just networking. She wasn't even acting like someone who had a husband waiting for her at home. She was here for something else. The man she was speaking to, no, flirting with, leaned in closer, his lips dangerously near her ear as he whispered something back. I couldn't hear the words over the sound of the room, but whatever he said made her laugh. A soft, intimate laugh that sent a wave of nausea through me. This wasn't the woman I knew. Or maybe, this was who she really was, and I had been blind to it all along. I forced myself to take a breath, to push down the urge to storm over and make a scene. As much as I wanted answers, I couldn't let emotions cloud my judgment. If I confronted her now, she'd twist the truth, spin some excuse, make me out to be paranoid. No, I needed to see the truth for myself. So I stepped further into the room, careful to stay in the periphery. The house was even bigger inside than I had imagined. The decor was modern, sleek, expensive. Soft, golden lighting glowed against the marble floors. A few large windows overlooked the city skyline in the distance. The guests moved with a kind of effortless confidence, sipping expensive wine, murmuring in hushed conversations, casting knowing glances at one another. There was an energy in the air that I couldn't quite place. Then, something shifted. Lillian and the man. He was older than I had first thought, mid-40s maybe, with sharp features and an expensive watch, finished their quiet conversation. He gestured toward a hallway leading further into the house, and she followed him. I clenched my jaw, my heartbeat loud in my ears. What was back there? I moved quickly, careful not to attract attention, keeping my distance but close enough that I wouldn't lose them. The further we went down the hallway, the quieter the party noise became. The lighting changed, dimmer, more intimate. The guests in this part of the house weren't mingling casually. They were in pairs, talking in hushed voices, standing closer than necessary. My stomach twisted. Lillian had never been the type to wander into places like this. Had she? I watched as she and the man turned a corner, stepping into what looked like a private lounge. I hesitated. If I followed too closely, she might see me. But if I waited too long, I'd lose sight of her. I took a breath and moved forward. Inside, the lounge was smaller, more intimate. A few scattered groups sat on plush leather couches, deep in quiet conversation. A long bar lined one side of the room, manned by a bartender who looked like he had seen more than he cared to. Lillian and the man were near the far end, their backs turned to me. Then, before I could process what was happening, he leaned in and pressed his hand against the small of her back. And she didn't pull away. She turned toward him instead, her lips parting in a soft smile. I felt my breath leave my body. That was it. That was the moment. I had held on to hope, right up until that second. I had given her the benefit of the doubt. I had wanted to believe that she was just here for work, that I was being irrational. But that touch, her response to it, made everything clear. She wasn't here by accident. She wanted this. A rush of emotions hit me all at once. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. I gripped the edge of a nearby table, grounding myself, forcing myself to think instead of react. I couldn't just confront her. Not yet. I needed to understand exactly what this was. And then, as if the universe was determined to break me further, Lillian took his hand and let him lead her toward a set of heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. Doors that led somewhere even more private. I swallowed hard. I had two choices. I could walk away now, pretend I never saw any of this, and deal with it in the morning. Or I could follow them, and see exactly how far she was willing to go. I already knew which choice I was going to make. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down at a truth I wasn't ready to face. But there was no turning back now. Lillian had made a choice. And now, I was about to see just how deep her betrayal ran. I moved quickly, keeping a safe distance as I followed them toward the heavy wooden doors. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out the muffled conversations around me. A few guests noticed me, curious glances, subtle smirks, but no one stopped me. They probably assumed I was meant to be here, that I was part of this. Lillian and the man disappeared behind the doors, and for a moment, I hesitated. My breath felt tight in my chest. Did I really want to see this? Did I need to? Yes. I had spent years loving this woman, trusting her. If she was throwing that away, I wasn't going to turn a blind eye. I needed to know. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. I pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The atmosphere shifted the second I stepped through. The room was darker, the lighting lower than the rest of the house. Soft music played in the background, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and perfume. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was controlled. Exclusive. The guests here weren't mingling over cocktails and small talk. They were closer, more intimate. Their conversations weren't about work or networking. They were about each other. And then I spotted Lillian. She was standing near the center of the room, facing the man she had walked in with. Her body language was different now. Relaxed. Familiar. She wasn't just talking to him. She was engaging him. Like they had done this before. My stomach twisted. I moved along the edges of the room, trying to stay hidden while getting closer. The sounds, the whispered conversations, the subtle touches between the guests, It was all too much. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my body kept moving forward. And then I heard her laugh. That soft, intimate sound that had once belonged only to me. And I knew I wasn't just witnessing a mistake. This wasn't an innocent misunderstanding. Lillian had crossed the line long before tonight. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. If I lost control now, I'd never get the full truth. I needed to know how far she was willing to go. And she gave me my answer moments later. The man leaned in, whispering something into her ear. And Lillian, my wife, the woman I had shared nearly a decade with, smiled and nodded. Then, she took his hand and let him lead her away. My vision blurred. I wanted to move, to stop her, to grab her and demand an explanation. But my body felt like it was made of stone. The realization hit me like a freight train. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even think about me. She had already made her decision. The man guided her toward a hallway at the far end of the room. Another set of doors. Another level of secrecy. I forced myself to follow. I couldn't let her disappear, not without knowing exactly what I was dealing with. When they reached the doors, the man exchanged a quiet word with someone standing nearby. A subtle nod, a glance in Lillian's direction. Then, as if she had been here before, she stepped inside without hesitation, and the doors shut behind her. I stopped in my tracks. I had come this far. I had seen enough, but I needed more. I had to know the full truth, no matter how much it hurt. I took a breath, steadying myself, and stepped forward. And then, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I turned sharply, my pulse racing. A man in a suit, someone I hadn't noticed before, stood beside me. He wasn't aggressive, but his grip was firm. "Not your scene," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my expression neutral. I was invited. His eyes flickered with amusement. "No, you weren't." For a second, I thought he was going to escort me out. That this was it. I wouldn't get the answers I came for. But then, he released my shoulder and nodded toward the door. "Go ahead," he murmured. "But you won't like what you see." My stomach dropped. I hesitated only for a moment. Then, bracing myself for the worst, I stepped inside. The moment I stepped inside, I knew I had crossed a line I could never uncross. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with an unfamiliar energy, one I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't loud or chaotic. No, it was something else entirely. Something far more calculated. Intimate. The walls were lined with plush seating, expensive art, and softly glowing fixtures that cast long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. A few scattered groups sat in hushed conversation, their words barely audible over the soft music that played in the background. There was an unmistakable sense of exclusivity here, of secrecy. I moved carefully, keeping to the edges, scanning the room for any sign of Lillian. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I had told myself that I needed the truth, but now that I was here, I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. Then, I saw her. She was standing near the far side of the room, her back to me, speaking to the man who had led her in. He stood close, too close. And Lillian, she wasn't pulling away. She was smiling. Not the polite smile she used at work, or the casual one she gave to acquaintances. No, this was different. This was the kind of smile she used to save just for me. Genuine, warm, intimate. My stomach churned. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, that this was all some misunderstanding, that I had built it up in my head to be worse than it really was. But then, she reached out and ran her fingers along the sleeve of his suit. It was a small gesture, subtle, something an outsider might not have even noticed. But to me, it was a betrayal in its purest form, because I knew that touch. I had felt it 1,000 times before, when she wanted my attention, when she was teasing me, when she was mine. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay put. I needed to see more. The man said something, and Lillian let out a soft laugh, tilting her head slightly, exposing the curve of her neck. It was a gesture of comfort, of familiarity. Then, without hesitation, he placed a hand on the small of her back, and she let him. I gripped the edge of a nearby table, my vision swimming. This wasn't just a work event. It wasn't an innocent party. Lillian knew exactly what this was, and she had chosen to be here. I was about to step forward when something unexpected happened. She glanced around the room, her gaze flickering across the guests, casual but alert, like she was making sure she wasn't being watched. Then, for the briefest moment, her eyes landed on me. My breath caught in my throat. For half a second, everything stopped. She didn't react, not at first. There was no shock in her expression, no immediate guilt, but something flashed in her eyes. Something cold, calculating. Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned back to the man, leaned in, and whispered something into his ear. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. That was it. That was all the confirmation I needed. She knew I was here, and she didn't care. A sick, hollow feeling spread through my chest. I had expected panic, a look of fear, an attempt to explain herself. But this was worse. I forced myself to breathe, my hands shaking as I stepped back toward the door. I had seen enough, more than enough. I turned, ready to leave, but before I could reach the exit, a voice stopped me. Rough night? I stiffened. The same man who had warned me earlier stood near the entrance, watching me with an amused expression. He wasn't mocking me, not exactly, but there was something knowing in his eyes, like he had seen this play out before. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was too tight. He let out a quiet sigh, crossing his arms. Let me give you some advice. I turned slightly, just enough to look at him. He tilted his head toward the room behind me. Whatever you think you're going to find here, it's worse. I swallowed hard. You don't even know me. He smirked. I don't have to. I've seen that look before. The way you're standing. The way your hands are clenched like you want to hit something but don't know where to aim. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to loosen my grip. Go home, he said simply. Walk away while you still can. His words should have angered me, but instead, they only made me feel more exposed. Like he had stripped me down to my rawest, most vulnerable state. But I couldn't just leave. Not yet. So I turned back toward the door, ignoring the pounding in my chest, and pushed it open. And just like that, I stepped out of my old life, and into the truth I had been trying to avoid. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face as I stepped outside. It should have grounded me, should have given me a moment to collect myself, but instead, it only made everything feel more surreal. I had come here looking for answers, and now that I had them, I wished I hadn't. Lillian wasn't drunk. She wasn't being coerced. She wasn't in some situation she couldn't get out of. She was choosing this. And worst of all, she had seen me. She knew I was there. And still, she stayed. Still, she smiled. I leaned against my car, my breathing ragged. My mind kept replaying that moment, her eyes locking onto mine, that fleeting hesitation before she turned away, before she whispered into that man's ear. I didn't know what she had said, but I could guess. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't sorry. She was just done with me. A part of me wanted to go back inside, to drag her out, to demand an explanation, to make her look me in the eye and say it. But what good would that do? She had already told me everything I needed to know without saying a single word. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. How had I been so blind? I had spent years believing we had something real, that our marriage meant something. But now I was standing in a stranger's driveway, watching the house where my wife had disappeared, wondering how long she had been lying to me. I needed to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Not yet. I looked down at my phone, my fingers hovering over her contact. My first instinct was to call her, to force a conversation she clearly didn't want to have. But before I could press the button, a notification popped up. A message. Not from her, but from him. The man she had been with. My blood ran cold. The message was short. Go home. That was it. 2 words. No threats, no explanations, just a command. A dismissal. I stared at the screen, my fingers tightening around the phone. Who the hell was this guy? Was he the reason Lillian had been acting so different these past few months? The sudden gym sessions, the new clothes, the late nights? Had she met him at work? At the grocery store? Had he been in my house? Sitting on my couch? I wanted to text back, to ask him who he thought he was. But I didn't. Instead, I did something even worse. I opened our phone account again and checked her history, and what I saw made my stomach drop. This wasn't the first time she had been to this address. It wasn't even the second time. It had been happening for months, dozens of times, late at night, when she had told me she was working late, or out with friends, or just needed some time to herself. I felt sick. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It wasn't a drunken accident. This was a life she had built behind my back, a life I had never been part of. I exhaled shakily, my vision blurring. I had been so damn stupid. For months, I had let her gaslight me. I had ignored the signs, told myself I was imagining things, convinced myself I was the one being paranoid. But now I had proof, and there was no coming back from this. I tightened my grip on the phone, my heart pounding. I could feel the anger rising, the hurt, the betrayal, but above all, something else. A quiet, terrifying clarity. I knew what I had to do. Lillian had made her choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was still hammering in my chest, but it wasn't from anger anymore. It wasn't even from pain. It was from clarity. Lillian had already made her decision. She had chosen this new life, this new person, whoever he was, over me. She had lied, manipulated, and dismissed me so easily, as if our years together had meant nothing. And tonight, she had looked me in the eyes and let me see it. There was no fixing this. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I realized I didn't want to fix it. A strange calm settled over me as I started the car and pulled away from the mansion. I didn't need to stay here, to watch her betray me any further. I had all the answers I needed. By the time I reached home, my mind was made up. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't even going to ask her why. I was going to move on. The moment I stepped inside our house, the house we had built together, it felt different. Like it wasn't mine anymore. Like she had already left, even though her things were still here. I grabbed my laptop, sat at the dining table, and opened a new browser tab. First, I logged into our joint bank account. Then, I transferred my savings into a new account, one in my name only. I left enough for her to live on, but I wasn't going to let her take everything from me. Next, I searched for a lawyer. Not a cheap one, the best one. Someone who could make this divorce fast, painless, and entirely in my favor. And finally, I pulled up a rental listing. A loft downtown, close to my office. A fresh start. A place where she had never been. I had spent years believing that Lillian was my home. But now, I was about to build a new one. The moment I hit send on the inquiry, something inside me shifted. I wasn't trapped anymore. I wasn't waiting for an explanation. I was free. The front door creaked open, and I turned to see Lillian walking in. Her hair was slightly messy, her makeup smudged, like she had been caught in the middle of something before rushing back. She froze when she saw me sitting there, my laptop open, my expression unreadable. For the first time all night, she looked nervous. "Vernon," she started, her voice uncertain. I didn't let her finish. "I know," I said simply. Her eyes widened. "You know?" I nodded, closing my laptop calmly. "I saw you, Lillian, at the party, with him." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For once, she had no excuses, no quick lies, and I didn't need them anyway. I stood up, my movements steady, controlled. "I'm not here to fight," I continued. "I just want you to know, I'm done." She blinked rapidly, like she hadn't expected me to take it so well, like she had expected rage, maybe even tears. But I had none left to give. "I'll have the papers drawn up in the morning," I added. "I'll be moving out by the end of the week." Lillian stared at me, searching my face for some kind of reaction, some sign that I was hurt, that I still cared, that she could somehow control this situation. But I didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I grabbed my keys, walked past her, and stepped out into the night. The air was crisp, cool against my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. I wasn't the man who had walked into that party, desperate for answers. I wasn't the fool who had spent months ignoring the signs. I was someone new, someone free, and as I drove away, leaving my old life behind, I knew one thing for certain. My best days were still ahead of me.